Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Scouting System Development Workshop. I'm Ludi Wong, and I'm the moderator for this presentation.
Yeah. Welcome everyone to Scouting System Development. As Ludi already said, I am Ethan Talbert. I am the current scouting lead on 1678. This is my fifth season that I have participated in the FRC experience, and I'm presenting here with Kevin.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Kevin. I This is my second year on 1678. I am the part of scouting leadership on the backend side, which means I make the server serve. Yeah.
Next slide. All right. So, just a little overview of what we're saying on this presentation. We are going to go over why you should scout and why we scout. We are going to go over how scouting should influence your analysis of the game every year. We're going to go over our system and some lessons you can take from it, some steps to making your own scouting system, and some of 1678's processes and how you can apply them to your own season, and then finally a conclusion at the end. So, next slide.
Alrighty. So we know that not everybody already does scouting, and then people who do scouting might not do electronic scouting. So we've broken up the benefits of scouting into benefits that you can get from just scouting, and benefits for specifically electronic scouting, which is what we use. So in the end, teams will want to scout to be able to make their match strategy and picklist decisions on actual data, not just say, well, I feel that this should happen. So it's a way to make better decisions, or at least back your decisions up with something. Electronic scouting gives you other benefits because of the electronic medium that so it lets you communicate with your team and the people who are using the data faster. It lets you automatically sort and run calculations whenever you get new data, and it also lets you give more students the value for software development that you can get just as an educational benefit. Next slide.
All right. Now we know that we should be scouting, and now let's talk about how scouting meets strategy in the beginning of your season. So, next slide. In order to know what to scout for, the best way to do that is to analyze the game and know the game's rules well. We'll go over this in the next couple slides, but we believe that the best way for a team to know the rules properly is something that we do on 1678, which is a team rules test. If you take a rules test, then you guarantee that everyone on the team at least knows the rules to the extent where no one's coming up with like illegal strategies and stuff. And yeah, the main point of this is you have to work with the strategists on your team, and even if those are the same people who are developing the scouting system, to determine what is valuable in the game. And I think Kevin's going into that in the next slide.
Okay, so when you get down to it, FRC games focus, or at least what you're going to be scouting is going to be mainly focusing on scoring and descoring, because in the end, that's what's going to either win you or lose you the match. So when you're thinking about the game to make a scouting system for it, I should be considering all the different ways to score points and the different types of scoring that there are. So from a basic level, there are cycle points, which you can gain a bunch of times per match and just doing repeatedly, so by cycling. And then there are points that you can only gain once. So an example for that could be rotation and position control from 2020. Then also, sometimes there are points that you can only get in elims, and those can definitely help inform what you're trying to scout for. So an example of that would be the bonuses for RPs that you'd get in elims in 2017. Another thing to consider is that descoring can be just as helpful as scoring, because in the end it matters. It's just the margin of victory that is making the difference, especially in elims. So defense is always a way to prevent scoring, and it's definitely stronger in some games than others, but it's almost always a factor. Another one that's easier to scout, and while it's technically a form of defense, it's a good example as to something that's a lot more easily scoutable. That's shot blocking. So it's obviously game dependent, but in some games it was a very important part of playing defense. So the other thing you need to consider is what contributes to ranking, because ranking will, if you rank high, you can employ your pick list more effectively, and also it can affect the way the game is played, especially with in the meta between quals and elims at higher levels of play. It just what robots were doing in quals could be very different than what they would attempt in elims. Next slide.
Yeah. So after you decide with your team what the best methods and most effective methods of scoring and descoring are, it's important to look at your capabilities as a team and decide what your robot should be able to do for that season. See Mike's strategic design presentation that I'm pretty sure is still later today. Just if you know that your robot is capable of one thing, then it better helps you scout in alliance members what you need in alliance later on. And we'll talk about that in a bit as well.
Okay, so once you figure out what your team's general strategy in the game is going to be, that lets you figure out what you would be expecting from alliance partners, and that will inform what you're scouting for. So once you know kind of what your strategy in elims could be, that lets you figure out what data points you need to visualize, and then you can work backwards from there to determine what data you need. Something that you're going to hear us talk about a lot is reducing the number of data points that you're actually collecting, because as a repeating theme in this presentation is going to be data accuracy. And if your scouts are trying to collect less stuff, the stuff that they do collect is going to be more accurate.
All right. After that, we are going to be going into integrating TBA into your scouting system and how to integrate various reported statistics that both TBA gives out and can be calculated on your own. So first, I'll be talking about TBA on this next slide. Yeah. So an important part of our scouting system that Kevin was just talking about is that we try to decrease the amount of data that our scouts are collecting, just that each data, every piece of data that they collect is more accurate. Because if you're having your scouts collect a bunch of data and like there's no chance that they can collect it all in one match, then it's just going to be bad data overall because it's going to be inaccurate. So don't collect any data that you can that is already available through the use of something like TBA. TBA gives out a bunch of stuff. They give out most notably in 2020 climb data for each robot on the field, which means that you can scout climbs by just pulling from the TBA API. Now, of course, it's released in February, which is after the FMS releases their API, which complicates development a little bit, but in our opinion, it's worth it to pull from TBA. Yeah.
Okay, so we're just also going to take a brief look at some of the reported statistics that TBA calculates and you can access via the TBA API. So all of these metrics have in common that they're trying to estimate different things for robots. So the first off, and arguably the most useful, is OPR, which is stands for offensive power rating, And it's basically trying to represent how good a robot's offensive contributions are in across all of their matches. So it's kind of like a rough average of how good a robot is offensively that tries to compensate for the effects of how good their teammates are as well. So essentially, we're not going to go into how it's calculated here. There's a couple of great blog posts written by Caleb Sykes on the TBA blog that go into a lot more detail than we will. But they use linear algebra to minimize the square of error from the optimal result. So none of these metrics are perfect, but some of them do provide a decent representation. Moving on to CCWM, which is calculated contribution to win margin. It's not as good predictively as OPR because it's also influenced a bit by opponent performance. If you're using any of these metrics, I would still recommend OPR just because it has the best predictive power. DPR is it stands for defensive power rating. It tries to do the same thing as OPR, but using your opponent scores to give a rough estimate of how good you are at defense. The issue is that it's hugely dependent on your schedule and who you play. So even if you're one of the best robots at defense, your DPR could still be bad just because you were playing a lot of stronger teams, so they scored higher than other teams than other teams played. Just strength of schedule related. Next slide. Not from TBA, but another metric that is used very commonly in the FRC community is ELO, which is based on a chess rating system that's used for chess rankings. Because of its roots, it really only looks at wins and losses and ties, so just the end results. It doesn't try to approximate scoring, at least as a base model. The reason why it's good predictive wise is teams typically will perform similarly to how they perform in the past. So that makes it good for predictions because especially at the start of the season when you don't have much data on how good a team is, you can take a look at their past performances and see how well you expect them to do in various matches. Next.
Yeah. So now we're going to go more in depth about specifics about creating the scouting system and using some examples from our own team, 1678. Next slide. Yeah. So the first question we're going to tackle, and the first question you should tackle when thinking about scouting systems is what do you need to visualize and what do you want to visualize? This should be based off of your analysis of what is important in the game, and should be based also on what your match strategist or your pick list people are going to use. So what this means is that if you decided that the most important thing in an alliance partner is like data point A, then you need to make sure that data point A is all in front of the pick list people when they need it, when they make that decision for what the pick list is, or else it risks the chance that they don't use the data, or they instead base decisions off of like non data things like how much they like a team. So what this means is that you have to make sure that all your data that you want to present is reduced into sortable, easy to understand metrics so that they can most easily make a decision. You don't want the data to get in the way of the people making the decision. You want it to be there to help them. Yeah. Next slide.
Okay. So the way 1678 actually determines what we're scouting for is we work backwards from the visualization requirements. Then we separate any qualitative data collection from quantitative data collection. So we have two different groups of scouts that collect either quantitative data or qualitative data. So again, we try and limit what we're collecting to the minimum needed to fulfill all of the visualization requirements, because in the end, we find it's just a trade-off of accuracy versus comprehensiveness. And in fact, there was a post on Chief pretty recently, a couple days ago, where they came the results out, that found that accuracy did go down as teams were collecting more data. It wasn't a super high sample size, so take it with a grain of salt, but it tends to confirm what the practices that we've been using for years. Again, we don't record what we can using Scouts data that we can get from other places. So if we can get it from TBA, then we won't try and scout for it. If you take a look at the picture here, that's actually the end result of what we choose to visualize. So by the end of week 2 or so, or by the start of week 2, we aim to have a prioritized list of all the data fields that strategists want us to visualize. Not all of these will actually end up getting visualized, especially some of the really low priority ones. They typically get cut off. So this year, we collected and displayed data for the first 20 on this list. There were, I think, 10 more after this that were not deemed high priority enough to make the cut, especially for our first regional. Next slide.
Yeah. Going into our specific principles about scouting and development as a whole, we just bundled it all up into this one little acronym that we are going to be using. The first point is simplicity. Like we were talking about earlier, if you reduce complexity on the end of the user, whether it be the scout or the people viewing the data, it gives for better accuracy and better use of the data. Now, that's basically what we've been talking about several times already. Just generally, if you decrease complexity, you make the UI as simple as possible, then the user is going to be able to use that software with better ease and more reliability in the end.
Yeah. So with all of our UIs, we try to make them as easy to use as possible, just because stuff happens at competition. It's very stressful. So the more simple that you can make everything, it's just going to be a lot easier on everyone involved and increase the chances that what you're doing is actually useful. So in all the visualization apps, we try and make it so the important data is front and center. The UI for the scouting apps, we make sure before competition and when we're designing the UI, we make sure that it's easy to use, that the things that scouts will use most often are going to be right next to where their thumbs are or their fingers are, or however they hold it. We go around and get kind of like a sample of how people hold the tablets, just to figure out where we should be putting the most used buttons.
Yeah. Accuracy is the third point. We've already been harping on accuracy throughout this presentation, but just to reiterate it one more time, if you have bad data, then that is effectively going to be worse than no data, because if you have data that isn't representative of a team on a team that either the people who are creating a pick list view or people who are creating a match strategy view, then that is going to give them a false impression of that other team, a false impression of their capabilities, which means that is effectively worse than having no impression at all of their capabilities. So try to make accuracy a very important part of your system. It is very important in all of scouting overall.
And the last thing that 1678 prioritizes as a core principle of how we design scouting systems is reliability. um, basically, like everything that you'd be doing in robotics, it's not really good enough if it works part of the time, because people need to be able to expect that they can use the data whenever they need it. If it's not available sometimes when they need it, then that's decreasing how useful your system is and all the work that your scouts put into it and all the work that you put into it. So by having as reliable of a system as possible, you make sure that people will be using the data because they know they can trust it and can depend on it being there. Versus if it's not always there, people might be less inclined to use it, and they might just not have it when they need it.
Yeah. We're gonna go over a short version of our system, just that you guys have some comparison. Our system, we use 18 objective scouts, which is 3 per robot on the field. Objective scouts are scouting stuff like how many balls did a team score. On a year that we're collecting climbs, they're collecting whether the team climbed or not. And we also have 2 subjective scouts. The subjective scouts, what they do is that they look each one. It's one per alliance, and they're ranking the alliance in terms of like subjective metrics, like how agile are each of the teams and how fast they are. Uh, those rankings, the ordinal rankings, contribute to a metric that we create called driver ability, which is fairly important in our pick list process. Now, all of those scouts are Android tablets, and we generate QR codes based off that data and scan the QR codes. It's uploaded to our Python server where data is calculated and put into the MongoDB database that is local on the computer. And it is also uploaded to a cloud MongoDB database where both the viewer, which is the app that the match strategist has, and also the pist is able to view. Now, that is just our system, and Kevin's going to go into why we have 3 scouts per robot.
Yeah. So yeah, we use 18 scouts at once, not 18 total. We generally have a lot more scouts than that, so we can rotate through and have everyone take breaks. But we aim to have 18 scouts on scouting every single match. The reason for that is data accuracy, like a lot of things in our system. So if you take a look at this graph here, you'll see that even with 2 scouts and definitely with 1 scout, which is represented in blue, 2 scouts in yellow, and the full competition set of scouts in red, you can see that it's significantly more accurate, lower is better, to have 3 scouts at once, especially in the more used data fields. The reason for this is human error. Scouts aren't perfect. We shouldn't expect them to be. So basically, the way we have 3 scouts is we use them to check the data against each other. So by having 3 of them, we can then, if one of them makes a mistake, we just take what the other 2 people say. If all 3 of them get different answers, we basically average it out and assume that's what the team did in the match. So by having 18 scouts at once, it significantly increases our data accuracy.
Yeah. And now we're going to go into some principles that you should take into consideration when designing your own system. First off, we're going to start with next slide. It is choosing platforms. Choosing platforms is an essential part of any system. It's also completely dependent on what budget you have and what development budget you have. Now, so hardware, it completely depends on your budget and scouts. We use tablets. We know a lot of you teams use computers. We have also used phones in the past. It really depends on what you have and or what you're willing to purchase on behalf of scouting. Phones work by having internet. Like if you just take phones from students on your team, take phones from your scouts, and then put the app on there so that the scouts can just submit using the phone's data that it already has. That has worked for us at one of our competitions before. The software that you pick is completely dependent on what platforms you have. We use Kotlin for our Android apps, which would be for tablets. We use Python for the server, which is based on a computer, and we use Google Sheets for pick list. And analysis could be completely done in spreadsheets, so we don't even really need the server. I mean, well, we do, but in terms of thinking about development, the main point is that just think about what you are able to develop with in terms of both budget and development experience. And I'll talk about data transfer in a bit. It's just important to think about how your data is going to get from one place to another. Next slide.
Okay, you can hear me now. So when we are thinking of when 1678 is considering the platforms that we're targeting, we try and limit the number now. This is a lesson we learned the hard way, but so essentially we used to target something like 5 or 6 different platforms. In the last couple of years, we've cut that down to only targeting 3, and one of those is Google Sheets. The reason that we try and reduce this is because it makes it harder to use your developer resources, because they'll be splitting themselves up into a bunch of different technologies that they need to learn how to use. So say if you finish one app, then you can't really just assign developers to another app because they're using completely different technologies. So essentially just try and limit the number of things you're trying to teach your developers and the number of things you expect your different developers to do, because that just lets you be a lot more efficient with your distribution of labor. Next slide.
Yeah, I said I would talk about data transfer, and that time is now. So it's important to know that there's no Wi-Fi at competitions. You're not allowed to use mobile hotspots as long as they're not wired hotspots. So you need to decide how you're getting data from wherever you're collecting the data to wherever it needs to be. For us, of course, it's QR codes, which we decided was the best way to do it without using internet. You are allowed to use mobile phone data, like just connection just off the phone. So what we've done before is we've just had like mobile phone data. They type it into like a Google Sheet or a Google form, and then they upload it, and then it automatically goes into Google Sheets. Now, this is also dependent on what platforms you choose. If you have internet that is not based off a hotspot or Wi-Fi on any platform you have, then that makes it a lot easier. But we don't have internet for all 20 of our tablets at once, so we do use QR codes. The main point with data transfer is you just want to make sure that you have a reliable system that just works. The main point of data transfer is that it works, and try not to make it too complicated. Yeah, just also don't forget about it.
Yeah, adding on to the data transfer thing real quick. If you it's on the slide, but if you want to use TBA like we do, you do need to have some way to drag the TBA data from the Blue Alliance website to whatever you're using. So again, just something to keep in mind. we have a specific modem that's uses cellular data just for our server computer, just so we can download data we need and then upload stuff to the cloud. So just again, something to consider. The main thing with data transfer is that you don't need to worry about it much at competition because whatever you selected is well tested and works. Next slide. Okay, so the last step in having a scouting system, not necessarily the last thing you should consider or write, but kind of the end goal of all of this is to be able to display your data. So it's important to recognize that there's a difference in using your data for match strategy versus a pick list. Match strategy is typically going to need less data, and they might be looking at different data points than you would be doing in a full pick list meeting, just because you have a lot less time to consider your match strategy before any individual match. For both applications, you want to display just the data that they're going to use. If they never use a data point, then you probably don't need to show it to them. A lot of the time, this can mean that you're combining a bunch of different stuff into a single point, so it's a lot easier to just look at and determine how good a robot is at, say, climbing. And then, again, after competitions, a great way to ensure that you aren't giving excess data is figure out if there's anything that they don't use. So that just kind of goes into not trying to show them too much data all at once, but talking to your strategists about what data that they want to see, what data that they didn't use is a great way to improve your system in between competitions. The only thing we're going to tell you to add in the displaying data section is make sure you can display trends, at least in pick list. Be it in the form of like a last 4 matches average or something, or being able to graph the results for each match. Trends can be a lot more informative because you can see, for example, if a team really struggled at the start of a competition but has been picking it up since then, so maybe they had a really rough first 2 matches but have been performing really well since then, that means that just because their average is lower, they could go under a lot of teams' radar, and that's how you can get a really good pick that people didn't notice. On the other side of things, if a team started off really strong but hasn't been doing so well recently, that looking at the trends can be a warning sign that you might not want to pick them, or you might want to pay a little bit more attention to how they do in matches on the second day of competition if it's a regional. So you can use trends to inform how a team's doing and recently, and also how they perform in future matches is typically a lot closer to how they're trending versus just the straight average. Next slide.
Yeah. Something else that we do on our scouting system specifically is predictions. We predict outcomes of matches based off our own scouting data. Predictions as a whole don't need to be based off your own scouting data. They could be based off of a reported metric like OPR or ELO before the entire competition even. Predictions, in our opinion, are useful because they can identify tough matches that allow you to focus your match strategy. If we're predicted to lose a match, like a couple matches from now, but our next match we're predicted to win by like a 60% margin or something, then we can focus a lot of our match strategy efforts on the hard match rather than the easy match. This can also be used at picklist meetings at regionals or regionals for our team to project the final seeding at the event, which can help you plan how good of a picklist do we need to make. Do we need to plan for any other seeding option other than us being in first seed? Now, good predictions are useful predictions. This kind of goes without saying, but we'll say it anyway. If you have bad predictions, then that is going to negatively influence your team more than it's going to help you. Also, we use during event predictions, which is during the event because we have data at the competition that we use to make the predictions, but you can also make them before the event so that you can have predictions for those early matches, and decide which of those early matches that you need to focus on in terms of match strategy. And pre-event stuff can be done either using like pre-scouting or any sort of system you have there, or just use OPR ELO. Yeah. Next slide.
Alrighty, so here, one of the most frequently asked questions that we get in our, especially when we release our white paper, is what would we do if we had less resources to dedicate towards scouting? So here's the answer. We have used this system before for off-season events. So I think it was 2019 Chesy Champs comes to mind. And so basically, we didn't have a full scouting system ready because we were in the middle of doing a rewrite in the off season. So essentially, we threw this together, and I think a couple members of the sub team did it in like a week and a half. So we used just basic Google Forms to scout simple quantitative metrics like how many cargo were scored, how many hatch panels were scored, and then climb level. Then we just did all the calculations in a spreadsheet. The display was in a spreadsheet. And yeah, that worked really well for us. It wasn't obviously quite as good as our full-blown scouting system with like all the time data and everything, but it also took a lot less time to make, and it took a lot less hardware. So doing that, we were able to just piggyback off of our existing scouts phones. We just used cellular data for all the data transfer, and then we were able to just use Google Sheets. We didn't need any special hardware for running the server on either. Another thing to consider, especially if you're a lower resource team or you can't dedicate a huge amount of people to scouting, is reaching out to other teams that are going to be at the regional to form a scouting alliance. You'll see posts about this on Chief like every season. Essentially what that is you're collecting data with other teams at the regional for the purpose of everybody gets to have some data, and by teaming up you actually get better data and more comprehensive data just by having more scouts. So that's always something to consider if you can't get your enough people to scout on your own.
Also, another thing to consider with scouting alliances is if you are a more experienced team, then it's a good idea to reach out to local teams in your area who could possibly want your scouting data or could help you scout, and then you help them with the system. It's a good culture to be able to reach out to local teams and either help them or have them help you. Yeah. We're going to go into our some of our processes throughout the season that you can possibly apply to your own team just at the very end here. We're going to start with preseason. Next slide. Yeah. The most important thing in preseason is training. If you're developing using software that needs training, which is pretty much every software that you could develop with, it's important that you get your developers, whoever's working on that during the season, prepared by training with the software in the off season. Just make sure that everyone thoroughly knows what they're working with. You can also develop as much framework as you can. If your system includes a portion that is not season specific, which is pretty much every system, then try to do what you can in off season, what you can before you know what the game is, because the more that you do in off season, the less that you have to do those exact same things during the season, which is always good, because during the season you're going to be rushed, you're going to be under pressure. It's just very good to do stuff before the season. And also, if you already have existing code, then it's good to look on what worked and what didn't work and what you would want to change for the coming season. You can also make it reusable and more easy to maintain, which is what we've been doing for the past couple of years. We've been trying to make it so that we have to do less and less work during the season by making it a more reusable system, as it were. Yeah. Next slide.
Okay, so essentially, kickoff here is a pretty broad term for like the first week and a half of build season. So Essentially, obviously, the first thing you're going to do with kickoff, you're going to watch the reveal video, you're going to read the game manual, and you're going to, your entire team can figure out exactly what the goals are for this season with the robot. Like, what is your strategy going to be, and all that. So after you do that, that's when you should work with whoever's doing strategy on your team to figure out what metrics could be useful. Specifically, especially if you already have a framework from previous years or from working in the off season, which we would recommend that you do, what you should be doing is figuring out what's special about this year. So most FRC games have a pattern, or it's not a, or a lot of stuff is similar from year to year. So essentially, what you're trying to do is figuring out what is unique about this year that requires special tracking. So for example, in 2018, that was the first year we began tracking timeline because it was when you scored game pieces could actually be more important than how many you were scoring. So the earlier in the match you scored cubes on the scale, the more of an impact you would have. We will say that simply tracking scoring elements is not year specific. Basically, every game requires you to do some tracking of score elements just because every game has some form of scoring. So what you call them may vary, but in the end, the actual requirement to track scoring is not going to be unique. We aim to get a final prioritized list of data by week 2. That's just our timeline. It's pretty manageable in our opinion. So that gives you enough time in the rest of build season to actually develop the unique parts of the system, while still giving you plenty of time to actually discuss what's important enough to track. Next slide.
Yeah. So throughout the season, one of the most important parts of our development process is reviewing. We personally use a system called test-driven development, which is where we write tests for our code before we write our code. And then if the tests fail, then you keep on working on the code. And if the tests succeed, then you know that you've got a working system, at least according to how those tests were written. But you don't need to go into that much depth in terms of tests. Just make sure that your code is readable, the logic makes sense, make sure that the code actually works, make sure to test your code, and that feeds into testing the full system. Try to simulate competition environment when testing the full system, because competition is really good at finding the problems in your code that you may have missed in individual testing. So try to make it as similar to a full competition as possible. Data transfer is one of the most important parts of the system. So if you only test each part individually without testing the data transfer, then that is going to miss problems in the data transfer that you might have. And all this testing is a good time to get user feedback. Make sure that if your match strategist is using an app, or if the people who are making a pick list are using some sort of your software, then make sure that you get feedback on how that stuff looks. Does it have any stuff that they aren't looking for, they don't want? If they don't want it, then you can get rid of it. And that is good. Just get user feedback when you test. Yeah. Next slide.
Alrighty, so before competition, essentially our goal is to make sure that everything that we could do beforehand is done beforehand. Again, just because competition is a great way to have things break. So the more we can get done beforehand and feel confident in, the more reliable everything's going to be. So all of our pre-competition prep starts with scout training, which is where we go scout actual real match video. This provides both a great way to test the system and also to make sure that scouts know what they're doing. So make sure scouts know how to upload data or transfer it in some way, and also make sure everyone agrees on definitions. So I think one of the best examples of this is, when does a climb start and when does a climb end? It's really easy for people to have slightly different ideas on this, but if all your scouts know what you mean by when a climb starts and when a climb ends, that's going to help you get more consistent data across all your scouts. Before the competition, we also make sure there's a lead scout and an assistant lead scout to to manage shifts and make announcements to the scouts. This just helps keep everything more orderly in the chaos of competition. Again, we want to prepare as much as possible beforehand. So having done all of our scout training and our tests, we make sure that any bugs that we find there are fixed and that the apps are updated. We then remove all of the test data that we have. We make sure all the config files are correct and that like all the spreadsheets are ready to go. And then, especially if you're going into a event that's later in the season or if you're going to champs, we try and do as much pre-scouting as we can and calculate predictions and just get some basic data for teams based on the pre-scouting alone. So the reason behind that is just, again, to give the entire team, not just the scouting sub-team, as much of a chance of knowing what's going to happen going into the competition to help compensate for things inevitably breaking and going wrong once you actually start competing. Next slide.
Yeah. At competition, we have a couple things that we think are important. We get to competitions. We as 1678 get to competitions very early. That is because we want good seats. Good seats generally mean happy scouts because they can see the field better. So try to get good seats. See if you can beat 1678 in terms of getting to the line first and getting good seats. Make sure to give everyone breaks. That goes on with the fact that if scouts are tired, they are not going to be scouting as well as if they were not tired. So give people breaks. It also is, good to keep them happy and all. Also, have developers monitoring the system. What this means is that if you have any sort of output, whether it be like a place where you can see the data, which is pretty much every system, make sure that you have people who are looking at that data, making sure that it's coming in properly, because it's easier to nip it in the bud during the competition than it is to fix it during picklist night if there is a problem in the data transfer or somewhere else along the way. Yeah, next slide.
Okay, so at draft night, we export all the data into a spreadsheet. If you already have your data in a spreadsheet, nice. If you use something other than a spreadsheet, well, I don't know what to tell you. You're ahead of us. Then at draft night, we have one or two developers who are basically not there to contribute really to the picklist process, but just to make sure that the system's running smoothly. We also look out while, as the developers are there, we have them look for the metrics that aren't being used and the metrics that are being used, just as a way to get kind of feedback without really needing to go around asking people for it. So that's a great way to figure out what's actually being used, because people might not remember exactly what happened like a week later. So we highly recommend having a developer or two at draft night just to make sure everything works. Next slide. Okay, so working remotely, we're as new to this as everyone else is, but a couple of tips that we've been using. We've been working on integrating new platforms, so we've changed our philosophies a little bit. We're working more with automated testing as a means to improve reliability, but now is a great time to try something new, start working on the framework for something new, do a big refactor, just try and make improvements or teach people things, stuff that will be permanent. So even if we don't end up using the scouting system in the next season, we'll still have a really good framework moving forward. The other thing that we highly recommend doing is go out of your way to promote collaboration right now. Obviously, it's harder for people to work together now, given that you can't just turn to the person sitting next to you and talk to them. So the way we've been doing this is we generally did use pair programming for at least a lot of projects beforehand, just because that's part of the way that we do our training as well. But we'd highly recommend having people work together on assignments and getting backlog items done. And also just make sure people talk. We've done a bunch of team bonding work. So just try to make sure people are collaborating together as much as possible, especially, and go out of your way to encourage it.
Yeah. We're going to conclude here. I'm going to try to make this quick so we can have some time for questions. It disappeared. Next slide, if possible. Okay, well, I'm just going to say them. Basically, our concluding notes are that if a system hasn't worked for your team, then try again. Just make sure that you would... Oh, we're back. We're back. If something didn't work for you a previous season, then try to fix it either in the off season. Scouting systems are good. I like them. I may be biased because, I'm the scouting lead and all, but scouting is useful. So make sure that you fix any problems you had in the previous system. Another note is collecting data varies a lot from year to year. It's good to reassess what is important to your team and important to the scouting system each year. In 2019, we decided that map scouting was important based off the structure of our data. In 2020, we decided that it wasn't because we didn't care where they were shooting from. How we collect data varies from year to year, so make sure to reassess that. Also, just use the off season as much as you can to improve the previous year's system or improve your developers with training and such. Just do a lot of stuff in the off season if you can. There's still 2 months left. Yeah. I believe that is it. The next slide is some resources for us. We have our resources, the white paper, code release, software scouting at citrussurge.org if you need if you want to email us. I believe we have 7 minutes left.
The Compass Alliance has resources on scouting as well, so it didn't make it onto the slide, but go ahead. You can also take a look at the Compass Alliance for additional resources.
Now, we do have a question from the audience. How do you handle collection of data from TBA when the link between FMS and TBA is unreliable, as often happens?
The way we handle this is we actually separate the data that we depend on TBA for and the data that we don't need from TBA. So we just separate the calculations into 2 different parts of the database. And so we understand that we're probably going to get TBA match data about a match later than we normally would, or maybe half a match later. So a couple of the ways that we've handled this at competition is if we really need data, we can always just run another calculation cycle as soon as the TBA updates. But most of the time it doesn't matter that much. So it's fine if we get the TBA data with a little bit of a lag. So as long as we separate them so that it's very clear when we have the TBA data, that's the main way that we prevent any crashes or weird stuff happening because we don't have data.
Yeah, also with TBA data, at pretty much all of the competitions that we've gone to, at least when I've been on the team, TBA has eventually become reliable by the time, after a couple matches after the match that went wrong. If TBA data is being consistently unreliable, it's giving bad responses and it doesn't update properly from the FMS, then it's a good idea to separate it. And if that's consistently happening to you, then consider scouting for that data on your own. The reason we made such a big point about it was because TBA data accuracy has worked well for us in the past. But if that's a consistent experience that you have in terms of TBA unreliability, then we suggest that you might want to consider scouting it yourself.
Okay, it doesn't look like we have any more audience questions, but if someone in the audience has one, feel free to ask.
Yep, we got a couple minutes left here, so if anyone else has any questions.
I'm assuming we're good. We're pretty much out of time on that. So thank you all for coming. Hopefully this was useful for you. Good luck in the upcoming season or whatever ends up happening. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah. Also, another note before we quite sign off yet is that remember, if you want to contact us, we have the link. It's softwarescouting@citruscircuits.org. That's a good way to contact us if you have any further questions. Also, if you want to, see me on a panel, I think I'm on the panel at 10 o'clock today with some other scouting people. So yeah, that's a bit of self-advertisement there. Yeah, I don't think there's anything else that I need to say. Just if you are interested, just track down those resources. I do recommend the 1114 one. That one's pretty good.
Yeah, thank you.